Well, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get things going here. My name is Sean Sloan. I'm the Program Manager for Transportation Policy at the Council of State Governments in Lexington, Kentucky. And I want to welcome you today to this webinar focusing on the American Society of Civil Engineers 2013 Report Card for America's Infrastructure. Before we get started, a couple of logistical things, technical things to keep in mind. Because we have so many joining us today on the webinar, everyone other than our speakers and myself is muted. And if you have a question you'd like to ask or a comment you'd like to make, please type it into the GoToWebinar interface itself on the right-hand side of your screen, and I will ask as many questions as time allows. Also, this webinar will be archived on the CSG website. It will probably be next week or so before that happens, since we've got a few folks out on spring break this week. But you can look for it then at www.csg.org/transportation. Last month, the American Society of Civil Engineers released its 2013 report card for America's infrastructure, a once every 4 years assessment of current infrastructure conditions and needs in 16 categories, including 7 related to transportation. For transportation geeks like myself, this was the equivalent of Christmas Day. And for state government officials, transportation advocates, and others, there is a wealth of information in the report card to chew on, to reference in policy debates, to give you a sense of where improvements have happened, to see how your state stacks up against others, and to help you make the case for what needs to be done going forward. And I think it's safe to say that this year's report is more accessible than ever, thanks to the folks at ASCE. There are a lot of ways to get it, lots of ways to share the information, and plenty of ways they have made it relevant and understandable to a wide range of audiences, I think. So for today's webinar, we have joining us Brian Pallasch. He's the Managing Director for Government Relations and Infrastructure Initiatives at ASCE in Washington. Since 2008, Brian has been responsible for managing ASCE's strategic initiatives regarding infrastructure, including development of the report card. Brian has been a featured speaker at CSG national meetings and our transportation policy academies over the last couple of years. And in the interest of full disclosure, ASCE is a valued member of our CSG Associates program as well. Brian is going to take us through the report card. We were going to show a short video, but unfortunately it's not going to look good through the GoToWebinar interface, but we'll have that available later. And also, Brian is going to introduce our other webinar presenter, Kirk Steudle from the Michigan Department of Transportation, to provide a state government perspective on the report card and the importance of performance measurement and some things going on in Michigan. So, Brian, I will throw it over to you. Brian, are you there? I think we're having some technical problems with the phone connection, but we should have. Brian, are you there? Sorry, folks, just bear with us here, and we'll get the audio up for you.
Okay, Sean, is that better?
That's better. We can hear you.
Okay, sorry about that. I was trying to use a phone and a computer, and I guess they didn't like to work together. I started by saying I find it interesting that you called this like Christmas Day. I'm sure some people felt as though they received a lump of coal in their stocking when they opened that report card. But I think there is some silver linings in some of this, and we'll get to that later as we talk. But I would note, and if you want to advance the slide, that would be great. I guess I'll tell you when to advance. And we'll skip that slide because that's the video. Okay. Every 4 years, ASCE does this report card, for those of you that don't know that, and I'm sure many of you do know that. So the 2013 report card is a follow-up to the work that we did in 2009, and before that in 2005, and et cetera, et cetera. We started doing this way back in 1998, but we've made some significant changes, I think, in the last number of years that I think are making this thing more accessible, as Sean said, and I think more useful, especially to policymakers at the state level. We're pretty excited about our new format, which is a primarily digital format. we're able to bring you up-to-date information as a result of using this digital format. And also it makes the report card available to you anytime and any place, really, since you can download it to your tablet, you can download it to your phone, and keep that information with you wherever you are. So as we get started today, we want to remind you that you can go ahead and if you go to infrastructurereportcard.org, you're able to download the app, and it's available on iTunes or in the Google Store to get that for you. If you go to the next slide, Sean, one of the things we like to start with is a little bit of a discussion about what the grades mean. We spent some time this last report card looking at how we could better explain what the grades were. We've always had a grading scale. We've always had a pretty detailed methodology. The reality is, as you can imagine, we work for engineers, and engineers are relatively detailed-oriented folks, and we think that's a good thing. But we put together this very, if you will, a shortened view of what the grades mean. I like to say a little bit in English or common sense to help really the general public understand what we mean by these grades. And as you can see, we tried to make it pretty simple. So when you look at a D grade, it means poor or at risk. A C grade means mediocre and requires attention. A B is good, which we think is adequate for now. And when we see some A grades, which we have yet to see, we feel that those will be exceptional, if you will, and or fit for the future. Our focus in this as we look at the money that we need and what our goal is for the nation's infrastructure is we'd like to get the infrastructure to a grade of B, and that would be an average grade of B, so the GPA would be a B. Next slide, please, Sean. Let's start a little bit, though, by taking a look at the grades and the trends. As you can see from this slide, and this lists all of the 16 categories, and I would note that ports is a new category this year, America's infrastructure received an overall grade of a D+ in 2013, and that is up slightly from a grade of D in 2009. We continue to see categories of infrastructure that are simply not seeing the maintenance, investment, and frankly the modernization that would not only improve the day-to-day performance, but would save our cities and states money in the long term. The backlog of projects to maintain and modernize our infrastructure continues to grow, and in fact 2 categories that we evaluated received a near failing grade of a D-, levees and inland waterways. However, I mean, as I said earlier, there is some silver lining in this. The good news is that 6 of the categories saw improvements since 2009. So in spite of that, D+, which is, not a lot of parents driving around with bumper stickers, my kid got a D+, and in spite of that, we did see improvements in a number of the sectors, as I said, 6 of them. There were noticeable and tangible improvements in the areas of roads, bridges, solid waste, drinking water, wastewater, and rail. To highlight a few of those categories, bridges moved up to a C+, as actually the number of structurally deficient bridges is on the decline. Many of our bridges were repaired and improved thanks to coordinated efforts not only by cities and states, but also the federal government, which made those activities a priority. But there certainly is more work to be done. There's a large number of deficient bridges, and in fact that in fact carry mostly urban traffic, or mostly traffic in urban areas, and those sort of what we call urban deficient bridges, that's a number that keeps going up, and we're keeping a pretty close eye on that as we look towards already thinking about what the 2017 report card might look like. The grade for rail actually jumped the most of all of the categories, and it jumped from a C- to a C+, and we feel this is primarily in relationship to the amount of private sector investment that's been done in the rail sector, and we feel that they warranted that increase in grade because of the money that they were spending and the time they spent to improve their system. And some of you are already probably thinking to yourself, well, why did some sectors improve while others continue to fall behind? We feel the answer is a little bit of a multi-part answer, but yet in some ways a simple one. In the sectors where investments were made by both public and private sectors, and where there were innovative solutions pursued, the grades rose, simply enough. Now I'm going to go through a little bit of each of the categories of the infrastructure before I turn it over to Kirk. So, Sean, if you'll go to the next slide, which is a blank slide. Is there another slide after that, or is it just going to be blue after that? Oh, there we go. Okay, so that's a build that you have to do. Sorry, Sean. If you got to hit that 4 times, I think. Okay. So communities across the country are collaborating to address some of their most critical infrastructure challenges. We saw greater private investment in several categories, as I mentioned, and targeted efforts led by cities and states, in which several categories benefited, and several categories benefited from actually short-term investment in federal funding. America's rail sector, as I noted earlier, saw the largest improvement, moving from a C- to a C+. The uptick in this grade is largely due to the private investment in tracks, bridges, tunnels, and increased capacity from both freight and passenger operations. Within the surface transportation categories, transit remained unchanged, and if you hit return one more time, Sean, I think transit will slide up there, remained unchanged in 2013 with a grade of a D, as 45% of Americans still lacked proper access to transit. Roads improved slightly, as you can see, from a D- to a D, largely reflecting improvements in pavement condition across the country. And finally, we talked about the renewed efforts by cities and states to address some of the nation's deficient bridge problems, and we see that number of structurally deficient bridges declining, although, as I noted earlier, and I want to make sure folks understand, that number of structurally deficient bridges in urban areas is not going down with the same decrease as structurally deficient bridges overall. If you can go to the next slide, Sean, and you'll have to do this build thing again. Sorry. Inland waterways once again remained a D- as conditions remained inadequate and the investment levels remained stagnant. Our nation's inland waterways and rivers are the hidden backbone of our freight network. They carry the equivalent of 51 million truck trips a year. In many cases, this inland waterway system has not been updated since the 1950s, and more than half of the locks in the system are over 50 years old. There are an average of 52 service interruptions a day throughout the system. The projects to repair and replace aging locks and dredged channels take decades to approve and complete. In fact, there is a backlog of major projects with estimated schedules stretching out to the year 2090. That's 2090 under the current funding levels. You need one more return there, Sean. Sorry about that. Ports was our new category in 2013. We worked very closely with the American Association of Port Authorities to gather the information on this category. This category debuted with a grade of C- and is focused large, or C with a C, excuse me, not a C-, a C, focused largely on landside and water connections of the ports. The Army Corps of Engineers estimates that more than 95% by volume of overseas trade produced or consumed by the United States moves through our nation's port infrastructure. While port authorities and their private sector partners have planned over $46 billion in capital improvements from now until 2016, federal funding has declined for navigable waterways and landside freight connections needed to move goods to and from ports. In addition to that, the money needed to dredge our harbors is also a little bit locked up, as we're not spending all of the money that we take in our Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund. In rail, in 2012, Amtrak recorded its highest year of ridership with 31.2 million passengers, almost doubling ridership since 2000, with growth anticipated to continue. As I said earlier, both freight and passenger rail have been investing heavily in their tracks, bridges, and tunnels, as well as adding new capacity for freight and passengers to the tune of $75 billion since the year 2009. In 2010 alone, freight railroads renewed the rails, or or rebuilt the rails on more than 3,100 miles of railroad track. That's the equivalent of going coast to coast. With a high ridership and greater investment in the system, the grade for rail, as I said earlier, saw the largest improvement, moving all the way up to a C+ in 2013. Next slide, please. We've got a couple of them on here. This will end with drinking water, Sean, just so you know. Dams again earned a grade of D. The average age of the nation's 84,000 dams is 52 years old. The overall number of high-hazard dams continues to increase, and that number is nearly 14,000. And I'd like to make a little caveat on that. By high-hazard dams, the definition of a high-hazard dam is simply a dam that is near a population center, whereby if that dam were to fail, there would be a potential for a loss of life or for significant loss of property. So the issue really there is, as our country continues to grow and expand, folks are, in a sense, moving in the way of some of these dams, or at least the downstream effects of those dams. And that means that as a nation we need to be a little bit more diligent about how we care for the dams, how we're inspecting them, and how we're maintaining them. The Association of State Dam Safety Officials estimates an investment of $21 billion is needed to repair aging and critical high-hazard dams across the country. Levees again earned a near-failing grade of a D- in this year's 2013 report card. While we estimate that there are 100,000 miles of levees and that there are levees in all 50 states and even the District of Columbia, we are still, as a nation, working on a levee inventory. Prior to Hurricane Katrina, we in fact did not have any national inventory of our nation's levees. That inventory has been started, and as we began the 2009 report card, we were really in the almost beginning, early stages of that inventory. I'm happy to report that now, 4 years later, we've got about 33,000 miles of levees that are in this inventory, which means we know where they are. Some of them have actually had an engineering inspection, and we know a little bit more about them. But while, if you'll remember, we estimate that there's 100,000 miles of levees, so we've got a little bit of ways to go until we have a complete levee inventory to know where all of our nation's levees are. So we feel we have some concern that public safety remains at risk in some part because we don't know where all the levees are, and we also would like there to be a national levee safety program which would in effect help states and local governments do a better job of building a safer set of levees in their own communities and doing a little bit of work on maintaining their current levees. In the area of wastewater, the grade for wastewater improved slightly to a grade of a D. However, capital investment needed for the nation's wastewater and stormwater systems remains estimated to be nearly $300 billion over the next 20 years. The number that we have in the report card is $298 billion. The pipes, if you will, represent the largest capital need, comprising 3/4 of the total needs. Stormwater needs, while growing, are still not as large as the needs for the actual pipes relating to wastewater. But those stormwater needs, when cities have been told to separate their combined sewers, some of the investments that our northeastern cities are making are rather significant, as many of you know, and these are things that states are also having to deal with as well, and it makes it a significant problem all the way around. In addition, drinking water, as you can see, improved slightly again to a grade of a D. There are an estimated 240,000 water main breaks per year in the United States. And if you divide that by the number of days, you get to close to 700 water main breaks every single day in the United States. And while the quality of drinking water remains high, again, the pipes and mains are frequently more than 100 years old, and many of them are in need of significant replacement. That similar number that you saw above, that we talked above about wastewater, which was in the $290 billion range, close to $300 billion. For drinking water, the capital investment needs over the next 20 years are estimated to be about $335 billion, or in that range. So again, significant investments needed to deal with our drinking water and wastewater systems. Next slide, Sean. In the hazardous waste area, there's been an undeniable success in the cleanup of our nation's hazardous waste and brownfield sites. However, annual funding for the Superfund cleanup program is estimated to be as much as $500 million short of what is needed on a yearly basis. There remain over 1,000 sites on the national priorities list and more than 400,000 brownfield sites that await cleanup and redevelopment. As you can see, the grade for hazardous waste remains unchanged at a D. In the area of solid waste, that is the grade that's got the highest grade and continues to go up. In 2010, just a little bit of a note here, Americans generated 250 million tons of trash. However, the good news is that the United States, we actually recycle 34% of our waste, and that's more than double where we were in 1980 when that number was only 14.5%. The per capita generation rates for waste have continued to be steady over the past 20 years and in fact have begun to decline. So we're actually, each and every one of us is actually creating less trash than we did before. As you can see, the grade for solid waste improved in 2013 and it again earned the highest grade of a B, which is a B-. In the area of energy, it's important to note that America relies on an aging electrical grid and pipeline distribution systems, some of which originated in the 1880s. Investment in power transmission has increased since 2005, but ongoing permitting issues, weather events, and limited maintenance have contributed to an increasing number of failures and power interruptions. I remember being we were at the CSG meeting in the fall, and there was a session that we went to that was on sort of interstate compacts and how you could move transmission and distribution lines across states, and that's something to be applauded that you all are working on that. While demand for electricity has remained level, the availability of energy in the form of electricity, natural gas, and oil will become a greater challenge after 2020 as the population increases. As you can see, the grade for energy remained a D+. I know one of the takeaways from our folks that have been working on this is one of the more significant problems is not whether or not the industry has or wants to spend the money to improve the system. It's really getting the ability to do so through the regulatory process, and I'm sure we can talk more about that in the Q&A if folks want to. But there are folks out there that would like to spend money to improve the system, and they're just not able to at this point. Next slide, please. In the area of schools, almost half of America's public school buildings were built to educate the baby boomers, a generation that is now retiring from the workforce. Yet school construction has diminished to approximately half the level of funding seen previously. While no national data on school facilities has been collected for more than a decade, there are estimates for investments to maintain our school facilities that are at least $270 billion or more over the next 10 to 20 years. Schools again received a grade of D this year. In the area of parks and recreation, we know that over 140 million Americans use America's public parks and facilities as part of their daily lives. These activities actually contribute over $646 billion to the nation's economy. However, there's an estimated $18.5 billion in unmet needs for the nation's parks. In fact, the National Park Service alone estimates its maintenance backlog to be $11 billion. The grade for parks remains unchanged this year at a grade of C-. Next slide, please. In 2013, this is a chart that some of you have seen before, and we've used this in a number of our report cards. In 2013, we faced a total investment needed of $3.6 trillion between now and 2020 across all 16 of the infrastructure categories. To meet this need, this means that we face a funding shortfall of around $200 billion a year. That's that last column, the very bottom number there, per year, $200 billion per year for infrastructure. And actually, this is a slight, albeit very slight, decrease from 4 years ago. I want to make a couple notes on this number. This number draws on our 4 economic studies, which we called the Failure to Act series. That's some of the stuff we've been talking to when we participated in the CSG meetings, as well as some of the industry and government projections of the need for the categories in the darker green are sort of at the bottom. When you start with dams down to schools, those are federal or industry projections on the needs of those categories. These numbers look out to 2020, covering 8 years of infrastructure needs, and so it's a little bit of a longer time frame than what we've looked at before. So these numbers cover 8 years, again, going out to 2020, which is an appropriate time for planning and action, we feel. Next slide. So you might be thinking to yourself, why do these grades actually matter? And I would suggest that they matter primarily because America's infrastructure has a significant and long impact on our nation's economy. Whether it's the inland waterway system, our ports, or our electrical grid, America is connected by infrastructure. We know that we're now learning and understanding the consequences of neglecting these issues and that they play out every day. Some of us waste hours sitting in traffic, power outages have become more frequent, and we lose billions of gallons of water through leaky pipes. And frankly, these impacts cost us money. As you all are aware, as I noted earlier, we recently completed a series of studies called Failure to Act, the impact of current infrastructure investment on America's economic growth. What we did in those studies and why it's relevant to the report card is it shows the opportunity cost that America is now facing. If we continue to let these grades lag into the C's and D's, we stand to lose, or potentially we could gain if we made some of the investments, a great deal. If we challenge the shortfall and try to close some of the shortfall in this investment with about $150 billion a year, and that captures the infrastructure categories that we addressed in those economic studies, we can prevent a number of the effects that you see in the slide right there in front of you, which is if we don't start making these investments, we're going to lose $3.1 trillion in GDP, almost the equivalent to the GDP of France. We have the potential to see a $1.1 trillion decline in the U.S. trade value. That happens to be the equivalent of Mexico's GDP. And coupled with that, a loss in the year of 2020 of 3.5 million jobs. That's more than the jobs created in the United States over the past 22 months. Additionally, without making some of these investments, we'll see a $2.4 trillion drop in consumer spending. And finally, more pointedly, a drop in $3,100 in disposable income per year per household. That means right now the way we've been investing or underinvesting in our nation's infrastructure is costing every family out there about $3,100 a year in disposable income. And really what that means is it's money that folks are either having to spend on added fuel costs, maintenance to their own infrastructure, whether it's their car or the damage caused by the bad infrastructure. That's money that they could be spending elsewhere and using on other things in the economy. And while the investment needed may seem daunting, the real story of our economic studies is that we really can't afford to wait to do this, that it's having an impact right now on our infrastructure. Next slide, and let me take a moment to introduce Kirk Steudle, who is in charge of the Michigan Department of Transportation. And Kirk, I want to thank you for joining us today and being part of our discussion. I'm going to turn this over to you now, but I just had a couple words about Kirk. He's been with the Michigan Department of Transportation since 1987. He started there as an engineer trainee. He is a registered professional engineer and rose through the ranks of the department to achieve his current position. In 2011, he was named by Governor Snyder and appointed as the State Transportation Director, and has served in that position also from 2006 to 2010. He oversees MDOT's more than $3 billion budget, which many of you know what that sort of budget entails. I want to thank him for participating in today's webinar and appreciate his assistance on this, and thank him for his membership in ASCE as well. Kirk, it's all yours.
Hey, thanks. Thanks. Good afternoon, everybody. And Sean, if you could advance the first slide, we'll get right rolling. Well, I want to provide a little context here. And while performance measures have gotten a lot of attention in the last couple of years, particularly with MAP 21 Surface Transportation Bill passing and the inclusion of that, frankly, it's been done and has been done in the public sector and transportation for many, many, many years. There's been the government performance project that's been out for probably the last 7, 8 years. We've been using performance measures in Michigan dating back to the mid-90s. And frankly, it's been a component of our long-range planning in Michigan since that time frame. What we've noticed is in lean times, performance measures become even more important, and they really are critical to making the best decision when customers and policymakers are brought into the conversation. You have to have data. The only way you have data to stand up behind your arguments is to have some kind of measures in the first place to what you're looking at. Next slide, please. You'll notice down at the bottom there's a website. All of our measures are posted on our michigan.gov website. The first address there is for the governor's dashboard, which is all of state government, of which on that dashboard there are 2 infrastructure components that deal with public safety, or fatality rates, and then also deal with structurally deficient bridges. But then further from that, Governor Snyder introduced an infrastructure dashboard which carried that deeper into infrastructure components. That's available as well. You can also get at that with the michigan.gov/MDOT website, and all of these performance measures are there. And we're going to walk through a couple of these other ones as well. 2 I want to highlight. The scorecard piece and then the good government in action. We'll talk a little bit more about both of those. But these are public pieces of information that we put out on a on a quarterly basis. Actually, some information is updated monthly. Some of it, like fatalities, is only updated yearly, and it's all available for the public. So when ASCE comes out with a report card, it's great because it's another layer of measurement that's happening across the country, and frankly, it gives me a lot of opportunity to say, look, here's how we compare to the rest of the country, to state decision makers here in Michigan. Next slide, please. Governor Snyder's infrastructure dashboard has 5 components to it. It's an economic growth component, a safety component, condition, accountability, and mobility. And that branches out to 4 other measures that we have that get in much greater detail into specific areas. The MDOT'S Scorecard, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. The Federal Highway Administration Stewardship Agreement between the federal government and the state government is blended in that same manner. The STC, which you see in the corner, is actually the State Transportation Commission, which is the policy-making body or policy-setting body for the Department of Transportation here in the state. And then the Asset Management Council dashboard is made up of state and county, MPO, and township officials that look at all of particularly roads and bridges in the state, regardless of jurisdiction, to develop a strategic plan for moving all of them forward. In Michigan, there's 617 agencies that have jurisdiction over roads and bridges in the state. So the Asset Management Council is an attempt to bring all of them together to work cooperatively to advance the entire network as a whole. Next slide, please. So this slide is the MDOT'S Scorecard, and it has 9 major areas, has 32 measures. Most of this is on the governor's dashboard, or includes most of the governor's dashboard measures as well. It also includes some specific measures that the public may or may not be interested in, or frankly they may not understand. I would expect that most people on the webinar would probably understand them, because most of it is a lot of engineering ease, things that are important for managing a network the size that we have, or the complexities and the size of the people, but may not necessarily mean things to the general public. But we put it out there so that the public sees it. So we are very transparent of what measures we do have, and frankly, how we're doing. You can see the one on the slide here. This is from just last month, or actually 2 months ago in February, and you can see the variety in economic growth, things we're doing well in, and things that are yellow, it's a little bit of concern, and there's one red one there. And that just gives us an indicator as to how we're doing overall. Next slide. When we get to the real tangible asset like roads, it's the easiest one to see of all of them. It's what people drive on every day. This is information that comes from our Asset Management Council, and this is all federal aid eligible roads in Michigan, which account for about probably 40% of all public roads in Michigan fall into this category. This is actual data. It's not a computer projection. It's actual data of people driving all of those miles and rating those roads in the exact same scale. And I've used this chart in conversations with the legislature, with business groups, with environmental groups, you name it, and said this is what I refer to as the canary in the mine. The percentage of good roads are going down, the percentage of fair roads are going down, and the percentage of poor roads is going up at an alarming rate. And if I draw anything from it, I said, in the future, people can't come back and say you didn't tell us, because we're telling you it's happening right now. This has been a very powerful slide, even for those that don't really understand algebra and slopes of lines. They understand this picture is not good. Next slide, please. One of our other big initiatives that we have going on in Michigan is called Good Government in Action. And annually, Michigan does a customer survey, attitudes and perception survey of the general public, very broad-based phone survey, and most states do that as well. We've actually taken it a step further this year, and we have this wildly important goal to move that customer satisfaction number from last year was at 73% to 80% by the end of this year. In fact, there's that "How are we doing" button down at the bottom. You can go to our website, anybody that's listening and want to chime in about how MDOT's doing, we'd encourage you to go do that. We put this on almost all of our publications, every meeting we're at, every email that gets sent has that link at the bottom, and we're asking the public to tell us how we're doing. And it really has focused the staff to figure out how do we best provide the most important services to the public in a way that is very customer focused. Next slide, please. There's always conversations, and we hear it when the ASCE report card comes out, that the general public just says, well, you know what, the government just doesn't spend the money right. There's plenty of money, they're just too inefficient. So we in Michigan have decided in the last couple of years we're going to start documenting some of the savings that we do. You know, frankly, as engineers, we try to always do things as efficiently as possible. That's just the makeup of a civil engineer to start with. But when we started documenting, the costs really start showing up. And you can see on average we've saved $63 million since 2009. Now that's not to say that we weren't saving money back in 2008 or 7 or 6. It's just we didn't track exactly what we were doing. But clearly we're doing more with less. We've reduced the staff size here in Michigan by about 15%. That's about 450 positions. We've closed offices. We've reorganized the department. We're refinancing our debt. to take advantage of lower interest rates. That was a huge savings, but it's, it's a one-time savings. You can't go back to that every year. We've had a very aggressive move towards paperless. And in fact, we have 3 projects going on this year, construction projects that are completely paperless. Everything from materials testing reports to certified payrolls to inspection reports to changes in contracts are all done paperlessly, or paperless, and all transmitted wirelessly. It's improved process time for payments in just a remarkable way. A typical payment that might take 120 days, a change order was accomplished recently in 6 hours. It's absolutely, certainly going to be a cost saving for us into the future. We're looking for more public-private partnerships and sharing opportunities, energy savings, more efficient buildings, efficient lighting systems are all adding up. And then the last one on the bottom corner is getting good advice. We've, through our value engineering process, reduced our construction cost over the last 3 years and saved more than $27 million by essentially getting a second opinion. And that's been very helpful as well. Next slide, please. In front of you is the chart of the measure that we have for managing our construction projects. So this is the accumulation of a year's worth of work. And you see the original contract cost and the final contract cost. These are not individual contracts. This is for the year, so it's rolled up. And what's important for us is the aggregate. How well do we do at managing projects? The other slam that the public will always say is, well, government's just not efficient at managing projects. They're always over budget. They always cost more than they bid them out for. We have a requirement from our State Transportation Commission that we manage this program within less than 5%. These are the actual numbers going back to 2008. And you can see last year we finished actually at 0.34% less than the original contract cost. So as I look at this and hold this up to the legislature and say, look, even in our worst year in 2009, when we had an enormous amount of ARA projects finishing through the pipeline or moving through the pipeline, we were at 3%. That's pretty darn good for $750 million program, and we feel pretty confident with our ability to maintain that. Next slide, please. One of the other things that are going on is there's a lot of innovative materials being used all over the country. In fact, on the lower right corner is a picture of a self-propelled modulator used in the state of Utah that basically built an interchange bridge in the infield, and over the weekend they lifted the old bridge out, moved it out of the way, they closed the freeway, moved the new bridge in place and set it down, and basically had the road over the freeway closed for the weekend and replaced it with a brand new bridge. The diagram in the middle is what's called prefabricated bridge elements, and I've got an example of how we've used that here in Michigan. But that certainly is adding to reducing the construction time and reducing the impact to the motoring public. And then on the far left is an innovative material called carbon fiber tubes. These tubes actually can be carried to the job site in a cardboard box. They then are inflated and filled with concrete. They're allowed to cure on site, and then you can see you can pick them up with a relatively small piece of equipment, set them in place, put some forms on top of backfill, and you have an arched bridge for a lower volume road. This picture happens to be from the state of Maine. We also did one similar in a rural part of Michigan, and what we found was we were able to produce a bridge for about half the cost in about a third of the time. And it will certainly work in low-volume areas. I wouldn't suggest that we would have these on interstate routes anytime soon, but for low-volume roads, this was a very good alternative coming for the future. I want to finish with 3 projects as examples that we have going forward. So if you could put the next slide up. This is Interstate 75. It's kind of in the the middle of Michigan, so it's on the far end of the northern end of I-75 in the country. This was bid out as a $29 million project. It's about 8 miles, and it was scheduled to be completed over 2 years. The contractor came to us with an accelerated construction schedule and said, we think we can do this in 1 year, and we want to use stringless paving, which had been used in a couple of other states, had not been used here. And we said, all right, that sounds really good, but one of our most important issues is mobility on the weekends, Fridays and Sundays. This is heavily traveled as a tourist route, and we needed to make sure that we had all lanes open in each direction. So the contractor came forward with a movable barrier that was moved twice a week so that we kept 2 lanes going in each direction on the Friday, or 2 lanes going in the north direction on Friday and south on Sunday, and then the other lane, the other direction was down to 1 lane, and was certainly very, very successful. Next slide, please. This M22 project was a very unique project in that there was a river that was eroding the bank next to a state highway. And we had watched it for years and years. We had put temporary riprap in. We were unable to stabilize the slope in any meaningful way. And it got to a point about a year and a half ago that we ended up having to close 1 lane of the road because we couldn't stabilize the slope. In this particular project, we used the construction manager general contractor process, which allowed us to bring the contractor's expertise into the design phase to design a project and a solution that solved the problem that frankly we would have never come up with on our own. The contractor knew the type of equipment he had, what he had available, and how best to be able to make this repair. This is coming up to be completed yet this spring. There, as you can see from that bottom picture, there's a little bit of restoration to happen, but we've stabilized that whole riverbank so that we don't have the potential for the collapse of the road in the near future, and we think for probably decades to come. Next slide. The last project I want to talk to you about is an accelerated bridge construction project where we use precast materials that were off-site, transported them to the work site, and set them in place. In this particular way, we were able to do all of that upfront work before we disturbed traffic to the general public. It was a small project. It was $1.5 million, but we used this accelerated construction technology, and we were able to cut 3 weeks of construction time off of this project, and that was pretty significant for the local economy. Now, we did this in a rural area. We didn't do it in the middle of downtown Detroit or a big urban area, but we proved it was successful, and we're going to continue to find ways to do that in those urban areas where that 3 weeks of reduction, or three weeks less in the construction schedule, is really, really significant in an urban setting. Overall, it came in about 4% under budget, so that was a pretty significant savings for a project so small as well. And with that, last slide, please. You'll note on there's our website again. Go in and you can get all the information I just talked about. Will be available on there. All those performance measures are there. There's a ton of white papers, and then there's also our customer service survey as well. And with that, I'll turn it back. Thanks.
Thanks, Kirk. I appreciate that very much. That was a good overview and gave us an understanding from your perspective, not only a little bit more in depth on what a DOT sees, but also how you guys take a look at our report card. So thank you very much. Next slide, Sean. We have a couple more slides left, and then we can go to questions. One of the things we've been doing over the last number of years has really been focusing not only on this national report card that we all talked to you about today, but we've increased our infrastructure policy and public policy capabilities across the nation over the last few years. Our state government relations team has made tremendous progress in making state and local resources available, like our state and local infrastructure report cards. And on the slides you see in front of you, the states that are in green are states that actually have a state or local report card, and where there's actually a local report card, we've actually noted the city that local report card covers. We'll work on where Sacramento is. I notice it's a little bit high up in California. As a native, I was not involved in that map, I'll jokingly say, although sometimes it feels like Sacramento's that far away from where I grew up in Los Angeles. There are now over 40 state and local report cards that have been completed, and the states that are in orange that you can see have a report card that is being updated or new one is in process. And so we're hopeful that by maybe the next time we release our report card in 2017, that this slide can be filled in completely, and we can tell you that not only is there a national report card, but there are state and local report cards. We work a lot with our local groups and state groups to make sure that they're using a similar methodology to ours, and if they're going to do something in Michigan, for example, we want to make sure that they're working with the state DOT, much like we work with the federal DOT and other state and local agencies. Next slide, please. And I don't want to leave you with the notion that ASCE is only out there grading the infrastructure. We also have a sense of we've taken some time not only at the high level, which is what I'll talk about now, but in a much more specific manner to figure out how we can actually go about raising the grades for our nation's infrastructure. We know first and foremost that dollars are not the only answer. I think, Kirk, you alluded to that in some of the things you all are doing in Michigan. We believe there are 3 winning and efficient solutions that are going to help move us from being stuck in the D's and moving us up to being in that solid B average. First, we feel America's infrastructure needs bold and compelling leadership and a vision at the national level and at the state and local levels. During the 20th century, middle of the 20th century, the federal government led the way in building our nation's great infrastructure systems, from the New Deal programs to the interstate highway system to changes made in the Clean Water Act. Since that time, we've noted that federal leadership has been decreasing and that the condition of the nation's infrastructure has suffered. However, a strong national vision, while it must originate maybe at the high level, at the federal level, it needs to reach all the way down to state and local levels and provide the ability for leadership at all levels of government and in the private sector to be successful. Second, we feel there's a significant need to promote sustainability and resilience as we're looking at rebuilding our nation's infrastructure. So that this notion of sustainability, resilience, and I don't want to leave it out because it is rather important, although maybe not as sexy as those other terms, ongoing maintenance must be an integral part of improving our nation's infrastructure. As infrastructure is built or rehabilitated, life cycle cost analysis should be performed for that infrastructure component in that system to account for the initial construction, operation, maintenance, environmental safety, and other costs reasonably anticipated during the life of that asset, such as recovery after disruption by a natural or a man-made hazard. Both structural and non-structural methods must be applied to meet these challenges so that future generations can enjoy and use what we're building and rebuilding today. Finally, our third solution focuses on how we develop plans to prioritize and fund strategic new investments in infrastructure that will position our nation for the future. The bottom line here is we need to not only have a proper funding source for some of our infrastructure, but we also must have a prioritized. These investments must be prioritized and executed according to well-conceived plans that both complement this national vision while also focusing on system-wide outputs. Some of the goals we think that should be focused on pertain to freight and passenger mobility, intermodality, water use, environmental stewardship, while encouraging, again, though, that notion of resiliency and sustainability. Communities across the nation are beginning to address some of their most critical infrastructure challenges, and for the first time, and I would urge you to go to the website and to download the app, we've spent a good amount of time talking about success stories in every state. because while admittedly it gets to be a little bit, one thinks that maybe we won't ever find improvement in our nation's infrastructure, we went out searching for it this time and found folks making progress, again, like I said, in all 50 states. So we've been able to provide in our state, within our state fact sheets that are part of the report card, examples of where projects and initiatives are making a difference. A couple of the ones that Kirk mentioned earlier are a part of those success stories. From a commitment, for example, by the Oklahoma DOT to address all their structurally deficient bridges over the next 10 or so years, to using green infrastructure to capture combined sewer overflows in the city of Philadelphia, which is not only going to clean up their watersheds, but it's also going to save them money because they're doing it in a green fashion and not a pipe-only approach. While there may be a lot of catching up to do, the trends are promising, showing that it's possible to increase the grades in the near term and in the long term, but we need to keep that momentum going to keep seeing improvement in the grades. Next slide. Finally, we hope you'll join us in our efforts to save America's infrastructure and prioritize the types of investment that are going to make our nation a great place to live and work both today and in the future. Here's some information about where to find the website if you're interested in having any of us come chat with you further about that. And now, Sean, we're happy to take questions from the folks on the audience.
Thanks, Brian, so much. And Director Steudle, thank you as well. We do want to open the floor now, so to speak, and see if there are any questions either about the information contained in the report, how it's presented, how to access it, or how you can use the information in the report card to make the case for infrastructure investment in your state. If you have a question or comment, as I said, you can type it into the GoToWebinar interface itself. Down below there's a pull-out section there that says questions, and I will read as many as time allows. And while we're waiting for those to roll in and for me to collate some, I'll take the moderator's prerogative here of asking the first question. Brian, since the report card was released a couple of weeks ago, it seems to have sort of touched off something of a debate in the media and in transportation policy circles about this idea of whether we're facing an infrastructure crisis or whether our infrastructure is actually crumbling. You know, just this week we've seen Adam Snyder's piece in Politico. Ken Orski touches on this in his latest innovation news brief. Ashley Halsey had the piece in the Washington Post over the weekend about the Capitol Beltway there in Washington, this politically iconic and logistically essential highway that is reaching what should be the end of its intended lifespan, and it's sort of turning to mush under the weight of 250,000 cars a day. And, you know, our friend Janet Kavanoki at the U.S. Chamber had a piece also this week called Playing Mad Libs on Infrastructure, where she suggests sort of other words we could use besides crumbling to describe the condition of our infrastructure. Do you think we're seeing more of this kind of debate over these issues this year, and what's driving that? And, you know, there are a lot of words in the report card itself. What are some good words that folks should draw from that to describe the state of our infrastructure in a way that is most accurate and most instructive?
I think that's a good question, and I think I will say that we've demurred from the notion of purporting that everything is crumbling. I do think we're facing a sort of, in some ways, a tipping point with some of our infrastructure, with the notion that many of the systems that we've developed, and I think Ashley put it well in the Post article this weekend, you know, the Beltway was built about 50 years ago with about a 50-year lifespan. And so while there's been maintenance and ongoing maintenance that's been done, there is some significant rehabilitation that needs to be done to that particular roadway. You know, we could go through the various categories. I do find it interesting. I mean, I think if we want to play example for example, we could spend a lot of time talking about examples of where there is, in fact, infrastructure that does not meet the definition of 21st century infrastructure. You know, there are still sewers throughout this country in some of the older cities that are wooden, and maybe there's nothing wrong with that, and if they're still working, that's fine. But if they're wooden, that means they were put in over 100 years ago, and we need to think about when we're going to renew them and rebuild them. I do think, you know, there's a way, in all of these numbers to make things look better or worse. I mean, I guess that's that is a concern. I would suggest you, and we can look at the bridge numbers, and I'm a little bit probably interested in what Kirk has to say about this. But if you look, for example, at the bridge numbers, if you just look at the straight line bridge numbers from the Federal Highway Administration that are produced yearly, the actual number of deficient bridges is going down. But the untold story, and we got a little bit into that when we were talking about this earlier, is the number of trips taken on urban deficient bridges. And so the number of, and not only the trips taken, but the number of urban deficient bridges has actually remained pretty constant and is increasing slightly. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, we have more urban area as our cities expand a little bit, but also we're not fixing those urban bridges as quickly as we are some of the rural bridges. And that's for a number of reasons, and that's not a criticism of any DOT, but those bridges are sometimes more costly to fix. They're more complicated to fix because you disrupt traffic in a more significant manner. And I think what our concern is that those are the kind of stories, well, you could look at one number and say, oh, well, the numbers are going down. Well, they are going down on the large basis, but on a more narrow look at it, the actual number of trips taken on deficient bridges is increasing. So you and I, when we're driving, are spending more time on deficient bridges than we have in the past. So I think the problem that we face is we do have a deteriorating infrastructure. One in many instances, depending on its system, is at the end of its useful life in many ways, and depending on the asset that we're talking about, and that we need to start addressing some of those issues. We're never going to have zero deficient bridges. That actually wouldn't make any sense. We would be spending the wrong kind of money at that point. But we should have less deficient bridges than we have today.
Could I jump in there? From a state perspective, there's a couple things. I'll give you an example of urban bridges. We've got a corridor of Interstate 94 going through the heart of Detroit that was built before the interstate bill was even signed. It was built in the 40s. It needs complete overhaul. It was built before we had continuous service drives. It has 14'6" underclearances. Everything needs to be completely ripped up and completely redone. And the impact is it's got to be a little wider. You need the service drives up on the top. But that's got 48 bridges in it that have been listed as structurally deficient for the last 15 years. And we've been holding them together with duct tape and baling wire. And frankly, this year we couldn't wait any longer. That project, while it's only 6 miles, is $1 billion in climbing. And we just couldn't wait anymore, so we have to take 2 of these bridges, which happen to be a state highway over the interstate, in the urban area, and we said we just got to rebuild them. It was either that or we were going to cut off the fascia beams because the sidewalks were cracking and the whole thing was tipping towards the freeway. It's a matter of bundling projects. If you go in and do just one bridge and then you come back and do the next bridge, well, you'll be there every year working on a bridge for the next 25 years. And the impact to the customer is just way too great. But then when you bundle them together, you get a number that is so big that just consumes your whole budget. So it really becomes a very difficult choice. When you talk about investing now and everybody says this is too expensive, well, we've run the analysis and we said for the last 15 years we've been using a very aggressive asset management approach, and we've documented with our pavement management system where the condition was going to be as we climbed up to a peak of about 92% good about 2 or 3 years ago, and we've been declining. We've calibrated that model to be plus or minus 1%, so it's pretty accurate. And when we go forward and run the model going forward with the revenues we have, we're anticipating a significant drop-off in the next couple of years. So what you're seeing is the beginning of the deterioration of which we know is going to happen. And that's, if we just let it all happen and then rebuild it and do the calculation, you actually spend up twice as much money than if you just spend it now while it's not completely gone and preserve it in the condition that it is right now. In our case, we said we can spend $10 billion over the next 10 years to keep it in good condition, or we can spend $25 billion in 10 years to completely rebuild it.
Yeah. I guess another question is whether we have enough sort of precise measures to be able to assess bridge conditions, and that's something that some folks have mentioned. And these terms that we have, structurally deficient and functionally obsolete, are maybe a little bit misleading to some folks, but some of these bridges aren't necessarily ones that are going to fall down tomorrow if you're driving across them. And Brian, I've heard you sort of give the example of the Brooklyn Bridge, which is technically functionally obsolete, but New York isn't going to tear it down anytime soon. So when we talk about how many bridges need fixing around the country and how much it might cost to do so, is there really enough information and the right kind of information to go on to make that assessment?
Well, I don't know if Brian's there, but I will tell you my assessment is the important number is the structurally deficient bridges, but it's even more than that. It's the ones that we keep from falling into structurally deficient. It's the ones that are fair right now that haven't got there. Functionally obsolete is an interesting term, but frankly it doesn't hold a whole lot of weight with me. I mean, we have another bridge, the Mackinac Bridge in Michigan, which is functionally obsolete. It is in pristine shape. We have no worry structurally about the bridge. It's functionally obsolete because it doesn't have shoulders on it. Well, it wasn't required 55 years ago when we built it, and it's probably not ever going to have them on it, but the bridge is structurally sound, and I have no worries about that bridge at all.
Yeah, Kirk, I would chime in, and I would agree with you. And I think that that's an area where one of the changes we made on this report card was really to change our focus on bridges solely to that notion of the structurally deficient bridges. We mentioned functionally obsolete because it is a measure, and it does tell folks something about a bridge. But I would agree with you. A lot of these functionally obsolete bridges we're not going to go back and fix. Were you going to tear the Brooklyn Bridge down? Not going to happen. And no one would suggest that it should happen. And I think I'll now use the Mackinac Bridge as another example. Thank you. That's a good one. And that's not one where we'd want to do something. But it does help us. This notion of the structure deficient ones, we need to start thinking about those. And I agree. And I think it is a pretty good measure, Sean. Not every structurally deficient bridge is the same, and we know that, and our engineers know that, and Kirk's employees know that, and that's what's important. But for us to be at 11% of the nation's bridges being structurally deficient, I think we feel pretty strongly that that number's too high. As I said before, I don't think that number's ever going to be zero, because I don't think that's the right way to look at it. Because we have, close to 700,000 bridges, and they all age in different ways. But getting that number down to about 5% and sort of always keeping it at maybe 4 or 5%, we feel that's a pretty solid approach and a good way to address this. You take a lot of bridges off that list, and we think that would be helpful.
Yeah. One of the other things that's sort of inherent in this discussion that we've heard in the last couple of weeks, and that some folks have touched on, is this question of whether there's a conflict of interest, essentially, for ASCE in touting this report, since your members would stand to benefit from additional infrastructure investment. What argument would you both make that ASCE is an objective source or an honest broker in this process, I guess?
Well, I mean, I guess I appreciate you raising that question, Sean. It's a good one, and it's an easy one for us to answer. ASCE feels very strongly, and certainly some of our members may or may not have something to gain in it. We feel very strongly that it's part of our core responsibility as stewards of the nation's infrastructure. If doctors tell you how you should treat your body and how you should rehabilitate your body and how you should take care of your body, engineers are sort of the doctors of infrastructure, as a way to look at it, I guess. And we're trying to say, on a whole, the nation needs to think about how they're taking care of their infrastructure, and we're offering some ideas on ways to improve the infrastructure. And I think that our members are really best suited to be able to do that. We would not want to go to, you shouldn't ask an engineer if you've got a back problem how to fix it, and we're not going to go to the doctors and ask them how to fix the bridge problems. Is sort of another way to look at it. We feel very strongly also in it, from ASCE's Code of Ethics and our ethical most of our members, as you know, are licensed professional engineers, and they have really a responsibility to tell folks about some of these issues. And sometimes it's a onesie-twosie issue where you've had engineers who've seen problems with a particular piece of infrastructure, and as a result of that have taken some corrective action that sometimes is very dramatic, like closing a bridge because they felt the bridge was in such a fashion that if there were more vehicles or more traffic on it, it could cause a significant problem, like a failure. There's that sort of unique, focused approach that they take on it. What we're doing with the report card is a little bit broader-based approach to that, which is saying, from our experience and our group's experience as being participating in this infrastructure development and building it and whatnot, that we have something to say about what's going on with it in terms of, are we spending enough money, are we taking enough time to maintain it and repair it, and so that's generally speaking how we respond to folks who say that we have other interests involved in that.
If I could add, as a public employee and have been since I graduated from college, I have no personal gain of the condition of the nation's infrastructure other than myself as a citizen and understanding the productivity that needs to come from that. I have probably 500 engineers, civil engineers, that work for this agency, and there's countless others that work for other state agencies and county agencies across the state that are publicly employed and do not see a gain. Their paycheck doesn't go up because they've got to manage 6 projects this year instead of 3. In fact, it's probably more work for them. It is a professional issue that I think you hit it exactly right on, Brian. In fact, I had made a note that said, does somebody question when the American Medical Society comes out with a recommendation that says, well, who are they to say this? Why don't we ask the CPAs if they think that medical advice is best? And I guess if this is what civil engineers do on a daily basis, that is our career and our profession, wouldn't they be the ones that you would want to ask to say, is this structurally sound? Is this a good path? Should we be building this? Should we do something different? I think just as Brian said, you wouldn't ask the doctor, or you wouldn't ask the engineer to go give you an opinion of whether you need, bypass surgery. I think from a professional standpoint, even most doctors would say, I'd prefer a professional engineer make the call on whether a sewer system is going to work or a building is going to stand up.
Another question, we've seen a lot going on around the country just this year, even right outside the nation's capital there in D.C., Brian. We've seen both Maryland and Virginia take on the transportation funding issue this year. If you look around the country, nearly half the states have either looked at the issue or are still in the process of doing so. Do you think that there's now sort of a realization that there's not going to be this massive infusion of cash from Washington, and so states are kind of moving forward on their own to address transportation needs this year?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're thrilled to see that the states are picking up the ball and trying to address some of this. I don't think it's a state-alone problem, though, and so I guess I would say that hopefully some of this action at the state level is going to compel the federal government to take a look at how they're keeping their house in order, because obviously, we think there's been a historic balance since the beginning of the interstate program, where the federal government is through its collection of the gasoline user fees, the gas taxes and diesel taxes, that they pay for about 45% or so of the capital improvements You know, we feel that's a good historic average, if you will, and we should maintain that. You know, obviously to do that at the federal level, we're going to need some changes in the way we fund our surface transportation program. But, you know, it's about time that some of these states are addressing these things. As a resident of Virginia, I'm pleased to see what Governor McDonnell did, and I think it's a unique approach. I think it's something that, you know, we're going to see how well it works out, but he's interested. You know, they took a new approach to funding our transportation program in Virginia. They came together as Republicans and Democrats. There seemed to be little, I mean, admittedly there's always a little bit of partisanship, but they did finally come together. It was more than 25 years since the last time they really addressed any significant new increases in surface transportation. And so, you know, likewise, Maryland's doing some similar things. I think they're waiting for the governor to sign that bill. And so you also had Wyoming. It's one that we watched as well, where they increased their gas tax 10 cents a gallon at the state level. So I think states are realizing some of what we've been saying all along, which is to be able to grow your economy, to be able to create opportunities for all businesses, not just engineering firms or construction companies or trucking companies, if you will. We need to invest in our infrastructure to provide the platform to have a 21st century economy, to move goods and services around. And if we want to be a country where we're exporting things and sending stuff overseas, we need to have a pretty strong infrastructure, not only from a road standpoint, but inland waterways and ports and other things. And clearly, you know, states are realizing that, and we're thrilled and hope that more states can do that.
We have a question here from one of the attendees that has joined us, and it is, any comments on President Obama's proposed National Infrastructure Bank?
I guess I'll take that one, and I'll let Kirk think if he wants to answer that question. You know, we've supported the National Infrastructure Bank concept. You know, from ASCE's perspective, it's another tool in the toolbox, is what I would say. It is not the silver bullet to solve all of our nation's infrastructure problems, but it is another way to approach dealing, especially with larger projects. You know, Kirk's talking about, he talked about a $1 billion project to fix, I believe you said, 6 miles of interstate in downtown Detroit. That's a pretty major undertaking. That's a lot of money. There are other projects like that all around the country. There's, you know, large bridge projects that go across major river systems that cost multi-billions of dollars. Those are the types of projects, or large metro or transit system improvements that would cost multi-billion dollars. Those are the kinds of projects we think that would benefit from the infrastructure bank. And when you're able to do some of those projects that way, you free up some of the resources in the normal programs to deal with some of the ongoing repair and maintenance work and improvements that need to be done on some of those smaller projects that sometimes get left behind when you have to deal with that $1 billion project.
So let me give you a state's perspective on that. We have a state infrastructure bank, and it's been in place for probably 15 years. It's has a revolving fund of about $20 million, and it's primarily used by local units of government that know they have a funding, you know, federal highway funding coming, you know, 2 years out, but they need to advance a project now, and it's very, very low interest. So it gets used very effectively for that. We have occasionally tapped into it, but not very often, because a $20 million project is small for a DOT's project. On the from a national level, our main concern is that it's still a loan. So while I could get a loan for $1 billion, what it does is give me access to a lower interest rate. But at the end of the day, I still have to commit future money to pay back that loan, which means I don't have money available to take care of the problems that I have in that future year. So all we're doing by an infrastructure bank or even bonding is just borrowing from the future. And the fact of the matter is, we don't have a good enough revenue stream to pay the bills we have right now. So all we're really doing is shifting that bill off to the future, and we're still not investing at the level that we need today. So while it helps, I view that as a financing option, but our problem right now is we have a funding shortfall. You know, we want to live in a big fancy house, but we have a minimum wage job, and that's our problem. We have to get a new job or a second job because we can't pay for what it is we want.
Kirk, I would only say amen, and I agree completely with what you said.
Well, we've blown well past our allotted time here for the webinar, but Brian, maybe you can sort of get us out of here on this question. You know, even as you're introducing the latest report card, I'm sure you're hearing from a lot of folks about you know, what's missing or what you know they might want to include in the next one, and what changes might be on the horizon in the future. Maybe you can sort of talk to those issues.
You know, I would say from our perspective, and I think we're still trying to understand what folks are thinking. I mean, I think one of the things I would go back to is we've really made this thing, and I'll at the risk of hurting my back, pat ourselves on the back of. We've really tried to make this report card the most accessible we've ever made. You know, you like I said earlier, you can put it on your smartphone, you can put it on your tablet, you can access it on the web. It really does have a tremendous amount of information on state and local infrastructure. There's all kinds of charts in there. We spend a lot of time, and thankfully through the willingness of some of your members, we've been able to include a number of videos in there that try to tell the story of infrastructure, and not only from the sort of what are some of the problems, but also what some of the positives are, the things that are good that are going on out there. You know, some of what we've heard is folks want this to be even more accessible, and we're going to try to work on some of that, provide some additional state information to folks, and again, we're looking at some of that information. You know, we think the success stories are an important part of that, to demonstrate to people what happens if we do make the right kinds of investment, the successes that we can have at the state and local level. The one area or question that I got on a previous call doing something like this is someone asked me where the category was for bike and pedestrian infrastructure. I will give you that as one of the comments. And as I said to folks on the call, we'll gladly bring that back to our committee. You know, I think when this started out, and if you look at the app in the beginning, at the very beginning of this, where we list the grades over the life of this, dating all the way back to 1988 when the Federal Commission did this. You know, we started out with 10 or 11 categories. Now we're up to 16. The good news about going digitally is it gives you, you know, a great ability to be flexible. Before we were paper bound, and that made it probably a little bit more complicated. But we're always looking at whether we should have more or less categories. So, you know, we'll certainly take a look at that pedestrian bicycle infrastructure notion and think about that. And there's probably some others out there that we haven't thought of, other categories that might be useful to look at from a national perspective. You know, our goal really is, if we're looking at the best way to improve this, is really to make this the most accessible we can, so that active citizens, not just legislators, not just policymakers, but active citizens can have a better understanding of how their infrastructure is affecting them on a daily basis, whether it's a power outage, a water main break, or a project that actually helps benefit them by making their trip to work faster, easier, quicker, safer. Making that more accessible will allow elected leaders to have a better conversation with their constituents about ways that they want to improve infrastructure, and hopefully we're able to be a part of that and help people do a better job with that.
Great. Well, Brian, I want to thank you again, along with your colleague Aaron Costello and all the folks at ASCE for helping to put this together, and thanks also to Director Steudle for providing the state DOT perspective today. As I said, this webinar will be archived on the CSG website. You can look for it probably early next week at www.csg.org/transportation. Thanks to everyone who tuned in for the webinar this afternoon and stuck around with us. I'm Sean Sloan at CSG headquarters in Lexington. Good afternoon.